I am Roxy. I am the director of an organisation called Kids of Colour, which is an anti-racist youth work organisation based in Greater Manchester. We do a lot of kind of joyful youth work within our communities, but we also do a lot of advocacy support that often kind of surrounds challenging systems of injustice, whether that's racism in education, the police force, the criminal injustice system. So we do a lot of advocating on behalf and with young people, specifically racialized young people in our communities to kind of resist state violence. And I suppose what I'd say in terms of our work is that safeguarding is almost the whole point of our work. It underpins exactly everything we do. It's inherent to what we do, except for the fact that what we're safeguarding and protecting young people from is the state, and is state violence, and is whiteness, and is all the harms that come as a result of those things. Those are often the places, the authorities, the institutions that many go to for supposed safeguarding. But for us, our kind of whole purpose is thinking about how in our communities we protect our young people from those many kind of institutions that are responsible for state violence against our young people. And I suppose in terms of why we challenge these kind of default norms and traditions of safeguarding is because for us, for our communities, for Black and brown young people, it's vital, it's life-saving work, it's essential to avoid serious harm, imprisonment, family separation, all of these things that kind of are impacting our young people and their families and communities every day. So yeah, I guess in summary of our work, if I think about safeguarding's position within it, it is what we're doing. We just don't place it in the same position that maybe perhaps many others do.
Hello, everybody. I'm Alex. So I am a transformative justice and sort of conflict worker. I collaborate with organizations specifically who are kind of stuck on thinking about how to apply their values in practice. And I specialize on thinking about that with a like abolitionist and transformative justice lens. So really thinking about how do we unpick punitive and like carceral ways of being from our organizational policies. And in terms of safeguarding, when Latifa first approached me before we wrote the workbook, what we were looking at are so many of the ways in which the ideas of punishment and surveillance are just baked into our concepts of safety. And a lot of the guidance out there is very reactive, and situated within like discourses of like risk and fear. And actually what we need in order to because these systems don't keep people safe, what we need is to build alternatives. And so there's an element of like creativity there. And so like some of the work that I do is around trying to think of some of those creative solutions and like find those gaps to like support practitioners to do things differently.
Broadly, I work with groups across like youth work setting, community arts, and community organising settings, around rethinking safeguarding, so reimagining safeguarding, and also working to like strengthen processes and practices around collective care. And with the latter, I do that in the context of my role at Act Build Change, where I've worked for the last 4 years. It was interesting because I went into that work having developed the Radical Safeguarding Workbook at Maslaha in the context, some of you will know the organisation Maslaha that works with social inequalities in Muslim communities. And I'd worked there for many years, and I was the designated safeguarding lead there. And in 2020, I think it was, I reached out. Basically, I was in that conundrum that some of you will be familiar with, where I was like looking for training for the team at Maslaha, but also being confronted with the challenges that that Roxy and Alex have spoken to around the way that in the context of Muslim communities and working with racialized young people, the ways that safeguarding apparatus not only doesn't keep those young people safe, but actively harms them in so many ways.
What is fundamentally wrong with the ways that most institutions think about safety and safeguarding? And what kinds of things do you see going wrong when it's practiced uncritically?
Fundamentally, they just cause more harm, particularly thinking about what it is that creates safety for children and young people. And a lot of the time, though, those being from like already excluded groups, and just a lot of surveillance, which then means that school children and families become scared to talk about the reality of what's going on for them, because there's so much, which just causes harm and pushes those families further away from being able to work with practitioners or get the support that they need to keep them safe.
It's always about the young person and the individual almost becoming a risk. And it's always the lens of risk as they look at the young person and how their behavior might be a problem, or how the associations they keep may be a problem, or how the way they exist in the world might be a problem or a threat or a risk to others. And what actually is never considered, or rarely considered at least, kind of external factors, or that kind of contextual safeguarding that Latifa mentioned, that lots of people within the contextual safeguarding network work on, to encourage places to think about how society is putting young people at risk, and how a violent state is putting young people at risk. But actually, what I see is that it's never external factors, it's never authorities, it's never injustice that are the risk to young people, but it's also always they themselves. And I find that it continues to become really ostracizing for them. At the bottom of the articles, there's always these lines from police that we can assure the public that this is not a threat to them. And I think about that line over and over again, and think about the way in which these young people who need protection or support are suddenly separated from public. They are not the public. You read that line and you see, don't worry, there's no risk to you. And suddenly they're not our community anymore. They're not part of us. They're not people we should be taking care of, but they're the threat that we're being assured of has no impact on us.
I guess like the conditions that a lot of people are working in and have safeguarding duties in, and the like the climate of fear, which is, both Alex and Roxy have spoken to, that exists within a lot of these contexts around who's going to be held culpable and who's going to be held responsible. And the very real fear around being scapegoated, particularly for those of marginalised identity. For example, I've worked with health workers where they've talked about one doctor who was talking about her experience as a junior doctor, where she was kind of confronted with someone who was in distress. But in that moment, while she knew how to work relationally with someone in distress, she also had this massive tick box form to work through, and questions to ask, etc., etc. And how in that moment, that kind of outcome driven safeguarding process that a lot of safeguarding process demands meant that the person in front of her in that interaction was lost. Often it will be more it will feel more accessible for a practitioner to err on the side of applying a label of at risk to a young person, so what Roxy's talking about, rather than be accused of having failed to act.
Such a common story that what happens is, by engaging with these systems rapidly escalate away from human relationships. They escalate away from connection and safety.
School was very keen to talk about anti-racism, much less keen to talk about racism or racism experienced by families, or to see how safeguarding was relevant to this question of, and safeguarding process was relevant to the question of what would stronger relationships with community and family look like. So yeah, that comes to mind as kind of just that dissonance that plays out, where it's we'll talk about anti-racism, but we won't talk about racism. We'll talk about, wanting to improve relationships with families through an art project, but not through safeguarding. And I think we're going to, come to later on in the discussion, this question of how safeguarding connects to other elements of policy. And I think that's really important, because one of the challenges, I think, also with how safeguarding is addressed is it's seen as like an add-on often, where it's like, okay, and then safeguarding, but it's not seen as central to like the culture of how a group works, or the questions of like, how do we work relationally with say young people or the people that we work with, and then it's like safeguarding's over here, but actually safeguarding is like at the heart of those questions.
Increasingly what I'm seeing is actually schools and teachers are doing the work of policing themselves, regardless of whether schools-based police officers or police officers have partnerships with them. But increasingly that choice to opt for a relationship with police is just so damaging to young people in the school space. And the lines are becoming so absurdly blurred to a point recently where it was actually recently a young person we're in contact with who was arrested on a very, very ridiculous, it was a very ridiculous arrest, but they had bail conditions as a result. But it was then the school that was responsible for letting the child know that they'd been NFA'd, so no further action. And it was the school that was passing on that message. It was the school that then said, if you want to know more about your NFA and your bail conditions, you need to come to a meeting at the school with the police officer. The police refused to talk to the young person and family in any setting other than that school meeting. So the criminalisation had to take place in their school space, a space that should have been a space of protection and of learning and of joy, which, you know, they rarely are anyway, just because of the racism that's embedded into school. But lots of young people still love school regardless. But actually, even that space was then completely harmed for them. And when we push back on schools for these kind of approaches, they see it as this positive strengthening of relationships, kind of like Latifa had pointed to, in terms of building trust in communities. But actually, they're just completely diminishing it. We've just released a resource with Liberty for youth service providers about those legal obligations, and that we should never be sharing information with police unless there is a legal obligation, because all information is intelligent.
What I see a lot is that a lot of groups feel that they see the dissonance in like the classic safeguarding policy and how their politics, their values, and how they work with communities. But then what often happens is they then just don't have a safeguarding policy, or they don't have guidance that actually speaks to how they think about safety in their spaces. And a lot of groups increasingly are working to actually be like, no, what do we actually do that leads to safety in our spaces? What are the processes that we put in place that means that we can safeguard the people in our spaces, and that can lead to caring relationships, etc., etc. That these could be things as kind of like, you know, simple as, you know, we have like safeguarding as a standing item in our Monday morning meetings, or like processes around supervision, etc.